everyone. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President, Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT, and welcome to today's Black Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation. WTTW is committed to producing and presenting trusted best-in-class content fueled by distinctly Chicago sensibility. We have served as Chicago's window to the world, and our purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. Essential to this purpose are our core values, in particular, diversity and equity. We celebrate differences, embrace inclusivity, and strive for equity. The stories we tell, as well as the people in front of and behind the camera and microphone, reflect the myriad of faces and voices of our region. Before we get things going, I'd like to extend a very special thank you to who you can see listed here. The generous support of these donors, sponsors, and WTTW members and viewers like you make it possible for WTTW to bring provocative ideas to life, to tackle the issues that matter, and to expand our perspectives on the world in which we live. There is only one reason why this is possible, and the reason is you. Thank you for your support. Now, please welcome our host, Brandis Friedman.
Everybody, thank you for joining us on Chicago Tonight Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation. As Tim said, I'm Brandis Friedman. So what we're talking about today, October marks 60 years since nearly 250,000 CPS students skipped school. But it's important to note that it was not a skip day. It was a boycott. Students and their parents flooded the streets of Chicago in what is now known as Freedom Day, a massive protest of segregation in Chicago public schools and the superintendent at the time, Benjamin Willis. Rather than integrate Chicago public schools at the time, he placed mobile units on playgrounds and parking lots at African-American predominantly schools to solve the overcrowding that was happening at those schools at the time. These students were also given secondhand books. Here's a clip from Chicago-based Cartemquin Films' 63 Boycott documentary.
Why are you out of school today?
Because today is Freedom Day.
Why, Mom? Because I want to march for my freedom rights. You gonna march?
No, I'm not gonna march. If I don't go to school, I'm gonna march.
Yeah, me too. Some teachers have been saying that if you stay out of school today, then they'll, give you D's. They'll fail you for the day.
I don't think they have any right to do this. And I'm not afraid of them myself, but they don't threaten me.
I'm unmuted.
Okay, so today we're going to be reflecting on this historic demonstration and the precedent that it set for the education fight years later, as well as some present day inequities within Chicago public schools. So viewers, you are all in a listen only mode, but that does not mean that you can't be a part of the conversation. We of course want to hear from you. So please chime in on the chat function with your questions and your comments, and I will do my best to share those with our guests. So let's start by bringing in our guests. I want to thank them for taking time out of their busy schedules to talk with us. As I say your name, I'm going to ask you to either turn on your camera if it's not on or to unmute. Rosie Simpson, she's a parent and 63 boycott organizer. And of course, she can be seen in the film as well. Charles Smith, a former organizer and leader with the Congress of Racial Equality known as CORE. He was also part of the 1963 CPS boycott. Don Rose, a political activist in the city who was the press spokesman for the boycott in 1963. And Tanesha Peeples, founder and president of the Roots Initiative. Thanks to all four of you for joining us. We appreciate it, and we're looking forward to the conversation. So, Miss Rosie Simpson, I want to start with you, please, because we know that you were an organizer and very active in the 63 boycott. Take us back to that time and tell us a little bit about the trailers that were in the school parking lots, the Willis wagons that you all were protesting against. What was that like, and what did those wagons do?
Wait, it was back then. It was horrible because our kids were relegated to the Willis wagon. They were in the parking lots at the school. The one that I was protesting against they were talking about building a whole school for elementary school kids between an alley and a railroad track. So those things were not only not conducive for education, but they were taking up the playground space for our kids. They didn't have libraries. There were so many disadvantages for our children. And that's why, and when they had empty school rooms further west, what they would do would change the boundaries when a school was overcrowded to contain the kids in the Black community so they would not integrate to schools. So that was that was the biggest problem.
And also, I understand like the schools for Black kids that they were contained into were often really overcrowded. Tell me a little bit about that, please.
Oh, they were overcrowded. In fact, they were so overcrowded. Some schools where kids were going to school, especially in elementary school, were going to school half days, and so that was one of the big problems. But they were tremendously overcrowded. You had 30 and 40 kids in the classroom, which and the parents were not allowed to participate in many of the schools in the education of their children. Really, they had the school doors locked, where if you went up to the school, it was hard to get in unless they requested you to come up. It was not free access to buildings, and then the really just the disadvantage of having those mobile classrooms in the parking lots, which I said most of our Black schools did not have libraries anyway. So, and there were very few libraries in the Black community.
Charles Smith, you were a student organizer at the time. Why was it important for you to get involved in this movement?
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're great.
Hi, Don. How you doing? Hi, Rosie.
Hi, Charles.
Good. Can you repeat that question again?
Yeah, I'm glad we've got some old friends here. I know the three of you know each other. So I know that you were a student organizer at the time. Why was it important for you to be a part of that movement?
First of all, I live in Chicago. It was important for me to be in the movement for one simple reason. I went to the public schools in the city of Chicago. I know exactly what Rosie and other people were talking about, and core Congress for Racial Equality whole purpose was to bring about issues that existed throughout America. We had chapters all over. So we decided what we needed to do after talking to Rose was to have a sit-in at the Board of Education office, even before the boycott, so that we could raise the issues and work with Ms. Simpson to make sure the issues she was concerned about could happen. We even had a demonstration at the site with the bulldozers, et cetera, for those Willis wagons. So I wasn't in the school at the time, but that whole issue, being a Black man in America, became very important to us as an organization. And so we decided to work with the community people to see that it would happen.
Don Rose, in the 63 boycott documentary, you said that segregation in Chicago was not an accidental matter. It didn't happen by accident. What do you mean by that?
Well, the city is, from almost the very beginning, the city had separated Blacks and whites, and after the migrations, they were in a few areas. Blacks were settled in a few areas, and what began to lock in, the first major thing to lock in segregation in the city was when public housing was announced in the late 40s. The Chicago City Council passed an ordinance that said there could be no public housing in a ward where the alderman did not want it. And at that time, none of the white aldermen wanted public housing. At that time, obviously, or legendarily meant Black people. Latinos at that time were not quite a significant population factor. And so the voracious Black aldermen took all the public housing in, and they wanted more and more people. We didn't have one person, one vote, so the wards were widely imbalanced, and some of the black wards were very, very big. And that public housing segregation, in effect, was the biggest single factor. And then the city, in the course of time, used every instrumentality it had, zoning and all the others, park districts and so on, to restrict black migration. It was very easy. Of course, it took many, many years for the courts to untangle all of this. But segregation in Chicago, as it is, let's face it, nationally, even though Chicago might have been one of the worst cases and the most segregated city in America, segregation in the North, which we used to call de facto segregation, was just as much created by laws and ordinances as the segregation in the South.
And in fact, I mean, like some of the housing segregation in Chicago is still apparent as a result of all the things that you just named. I want to bring Tanesha in here because, Tanesha is a present day education activist and advocate. You and I have talked about some of the issues the city has before. What did you learn from this movement? What did it teach you?
First of all, Brandis, thank you for having me be part of this conversation and even hosting this conversation, because it's obviously very important, and it's definitely an honor to be in this conversation with trailblazers that paved the way for us to be able to advocate for Black students and communities to get the education that they deserve. So thank you all for the Chicago Freedom Day that you led. As Ms. Rosie said and Mr. Smith said, and also Mr. Rose, some of the battles that they fought back in 1963, we're still enduring those battles today. We see a lot of Black students and families that are congregated in specific areas in the community, and they are attending schools that are under-resourced, schools that don't have adequate facilities, and schools that don't have enough teachers. And so to continue to fight this battle on their behalf, so again, they can have the education that they deserve, is important to us. And Brandis, I probably forgot the question that you asked, you know me, but if I didn't answer it, feel free to throw it back at me.
No, it's okay. I think you did, because I think it was just kind of about like what the movement taught you and what you kind of take from that movement and use in your activism today.
Yeah. And just to add to that, what I'm trying to, and what we're really trying to instill in young people when we're talking about and teaching history, is that we don't have to recreate the wheel. So thanks to Mr. Smith and Ms. Simpson and Mr. Rose, we have a blueprint for how we can fight these systems, and we can just, take that blueprint, tweak it to match modern day strategy, and still push for what we need. And so that's something that we're trying to instill in our young people so they can push for the education and all of the resources that they need.
If I may, I want to point out a repercussion that exists that's created problems very recently. They were building new white schools in a lot of areas as the Black population moved and the boundary lines changed. And we created, in effect, a dual school system. And it's many of those excess schools that were built in the period in the 60s under Willis that eventually wound up being the closed down schools of the 90s and the 2000s.
That's a good point. Thank you, Mr. Rose. Ms. Rosie, I want to come back to you and ask you a couple of things. What are some of the memories that you still have from that day, from Freedom Day? And also, how were you all able to organize so many people? Because and we're going to come back to Mr. Rose on this as well, 250,000 students. So what do you remember, and how'd you do it?
Well, I think it's because you had parents who in every community, well, then it was a different situation, even though it was overcrowded, the communities, the housing was bad, but you had people in the community, you had some areas that had block clubs, you had people in the community that was concerned about their children education and were organized. You had CORE, you had SNCC at the time, you had the Coordinated Council for Community Organizations, where you had organizations and churches all a part of one organization, concerned about the same thing, not only the education, but the job situation, the housing problems. And so it was much easier at that time. You had block clubs, and so you were able to organize the parents. And then we had people who were committed to, passing out flyers and going and talking to parents. You had the parents council for teachers, and so it was, and you had the students who were concerned. Many of the high school students were concerned about their education. So that's what happened. You had something going on then that you don't have at this particular time. So it made it easier for us to do that. In this day and time, you don't have the community, or it's not organizations and more not in that coalition that needs to exist again, citywide.
Tanesha, I see you nodding your head really quick. I want to get your sort of your thoughts on that, as far as like the absence of the coalition that that Ms. Rosie just pointed out. Like, what do you think is missing from today's activism?
Ooh, I mean, Ms. Rosie is absolutely right. I think that, first of all, the Black community is extremely bogged down with all of the fights, right? So we are exhausted on the just surface level, but there is no real collaboration amongst the organizers and the community-based organizations in Chicago. And I think it's for political reasons. I think that because activism has become popular, people prefer to work in silos so they can stand in in the limelight. And I think that education, as important as it is, has become one of those issues that is on the back burner, where we see people really only come out when there is a teacher strike, or when there's, when we saw COVID. And so it's been extremely difficult to organize around educational issues because of those reasons. And I would also say that, going back to the political landscape, so many different narratives around who's actually fighting for, families and students, specifically Black families and students, to really confuse the communities themselves around who are their allies and who are their enemies. And so just that the politicization of education, the weariness of Black communities, and the disconnectedness of the organizers and the community-based organizations all make it difficult to advocate effectively for Black communities.
First thing I heard you say was the Black community is bogged down with all the fights, and that kind of hits hard. Charles, I want to bring you back in. There was, the aftermath from the day of from Freedom Day. With, I want you to tell us a little bit about, what CPS lost and what they had to do as a result of Freedom Day, and whether or not you all counted that as a success, if you feel like it had the impact you wanted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I'd like to throw something to everyone here. The biggest problem in the Black community over all those years is what a group of former retired teachers, principals, etc., were working on. It's called intergenerational disconnect between Black folks from the time you're born until the time you die. There are 4 to 6 groups that exist that do not talk to each other, do not associate with each other, do not trust each other. During the 60s, during those periods, 60s and 70s, we had think tanks. We had people talking about all kinds of issues all over America. We're not doing that really in the mass we did at that time. And I think that contributes to all these problems we have. And then the whole school system, by allowing charter schools to get a foothold into the whole educational system, created problems. We still exist today. And that whole issue of charter schools need to be challenged. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh. And so I feel that the issue is education. The issue is redlining, even though they claim it disappeared, redlining still exists in the communities in Chicago. You talk about the west side, the south side, the north side. You only talk about certain sections in those areas. The rainbow beaches and the Gage parks and all those other issues that we rallied behind and tried to make issues with seem like no one cares anymore. The whole park district structure with this whole issue of relocating and putting people in. I understand the reason, I understand it, but you're not dealing with the homelessness. You're not dealing with people who are struggling to survive. You're not dealing with the seniors. Those issues need to be addressed before we take on other issues. If we have not done that as citizens in Chicago, and at my age now, I hope I can see it before I make my transition. However, those are the issues we need to be fighting about. And I wish the think tankers, I'll use that word, who made their transition were still here, and you would hear a whole lot of other issues that we feel are important, rather than reparation.
Brandis, can I push back on the charter school piece just really quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
And I believe in alternative forms of education and, marginalized communities having options. And I think that for as long as CPS has done a disservice to the community, obviously we were supposed to be advocating and pushing back to, have the resources that we need allocated into our communities, into our schools. And if we didn't get that, what other option would we have in terms of access to education if we didn't have maybe, private schools or charter schools, or maybe even homeschooling options? And so I think that when we're talking about the district at large that has failed our communities, some of those schools, I'm not saying all of them, have been outlets and options for families to get education and to have spaces where their kids have felt safe, where they've been able to be engaged, where they've been able to be supported into different avenues that maybe would have been career readiness or college. And so when we think about entire systems, just the same as there are good CPS schools, there are good charter schools and good private schools and good home schools. So I'm not saying demonizing an entire district or an entire, charter school system, but I think that having either CMOs or individual schools provided options to Black communities and Black families that didn't find what they needed in CPS schools. And so that's why I just want to push back on that, so that we can have as many opportunities or access to opportunities as possible.
And let me push back on that because I think Charles was right, because you have to look at the situation with the charter school. The resources that are taken away from the regular schools and those who cannot afford to go to the charter schools. I think that if the think tank and the people who thought of that had thought about being able, they could have done the same thing if they put those resources and things together in the regular public school. So we're taking away from those who are less fortunate, which creates more problems. Instead of using all the resources, we don't have enough resources as it is. And so I think that the charter schools took away from the regular public schools and those who are still struggling to try and get an education. And I understand that it's a challenge because we don't have enough resources, but I think that we should think about how to use the resources that we have wisely, and for the most part, that most of the kids get the best educational possible.
I agree, Ms. Rosie. But just two things: charter schools are public schools, so they are free. And the second thing is, when we talk about funding and per pupil funding allocations, those allocations belong to each individual student, not the school. And so when we talk about autonomy, especially around our tax dollars, parents and all constituents should be able to take their money where they feel they're being best served. So if you buy a hamburger from McDonald's and you're not happy with that hamburger, are you not allowed to go to Burger King and get a hamburger with your money? So, just want to put that thought out there around people having the right to do what they want to do with their money.
And I think that's one of the biggest. I think that's one of the biggest problems, that we've gotten so individualized, and in our thinking and what we want, that we haven't really thought through what is best for the majority, which is what happened with the struggle that we had, and that's why we were more successful, because even though many of us disagreed in the leadership, we decided we prioritized what was a priority to us, and I think that makes a difference. I'm sorry, Charles.
Yeah, just one comment about the charter schools. The charter schools' whole emphasis when they came on board was whatever they learned from their system would be shared with the total public school system. And if you talk to retired principals and teachers, you'll find that that is not what is happening. Charter schools came into force because they could not get funding, because they were not a public educational system. They could not go to the government and get funded. But if you go and look at the charter school structures, not all of them, but you look at the charter school structures, they're getting funded. They're taking money from the public school systems. So the young people who are not making it in charter schools are sent back to the public school systems, and they don't have the resources. So if you had an opportunity to speak to former teachers and principals, you would hear all of that being discussed. And the question is, did the unions fail? Did the people fail, or did the system fail? You have to ask those questions and come up with a conclusion. Yes, there are good charter schools. The battle with the 3 black charter schools, which fought and they got rid of the principals, etc. Are the charter school people certified by the system to be what they claim they are? Those are the issues that retired teachers and retired principals are talking about. And those are the people I'm working with presently on this whole intergenerational issue among us as Black African-American people. Those issues need to be asked by those former teachers, by the unions, and that the public school system answer to those questions.
I agree about the charter schools. They're just draining resources away from the public schools. They've created a for-profit network of schools that are partially funded by taxpayers. And of course, there's an occasional good one, but they were first started in order to duck unions. And the other parallel with that was the use of standardized testing, which was another evil that developed through the years after we were initially concerned about segregation.
So Tanesha, I'm gonna jump in, everybody, because I appreciate that we don't all share the same perspective on this, and that there are still some points of contention within Chicago public schools and our public education system and how it's being operated. Tanesha, it's 3-on-1 here, so I'm gonna let you respond to that really quickly, but then I wanna move on after you do that.
Well, I've been in this space for years, and obviously not as long as Ms. Rosie, Mr. Rose, and Mr. Smith. And I think that, I've had to learn to agree to disagree, so that, as Ms. Rosie said and Mr. Smith said, around unifying around a specific message, I think that we all agree that we want what's best for our communities, which is good schools. And so I think that despite the contention, we all come back to this end goal, which is how do we get the best for our kids who deserve it. And so that's always where I am. I'm just an advocate for choice, whatever that choice looks like, because if I had my way, we would have freedom schools in Black communities, but I don't think that freedom schools would exist under the traditional school district system that is CPS. And so when we think about the charter model, which is independently owned schools, and using that to build our own freedom schools, essentially it might be known as a charter school under the grander system. And then when we think about for-profit systems, the traditional school systems are the same. They're all robbing us. If we are infusing this money through generations, and at the end of it, our students are not where they need to be, where we have an 85% graduation rate in Chicago public schools, but for proficiency rates are in below 20%, that's not a return on our investment. And so we're getting robbed by the district, by some charter schools, by private schools, whatever. And so I think that at the end of the day, we all agree that we want good schools that are serving our communities, that are preparing our kids to be the greatest that they can be and that they're destined to be.
All right, thank you. I want to remind our viewers that if you've got a comment or a question, that you're welcome to drop that into the Q&A or the chat functions, and I will try and share them here as well. I want to get back to 1963, though, just a little bit, because in the documentary, you'll see that the aftermath of that Freedom Day, CPS gave a race count for the first time of its students. And that's where folks were finally able to learn that Black students made up a little more than half of the district's enrollment. And also because schools get money by the student, the district lost $470,000 that day as well because students were boycotting. So Don, you were the spokesperson at the time, and one of the things we see in the film is, kind of the atmosphere in it was, sort of not the campaign room, but it was sort of the war room, right? Where you all were counting reports of attendance and finding out, how successful the day was that day. Tell me a little bit about what that room was like and kind of what the energy was like that day.
Well, the whole operation that we talked about earlier was like a small or a parallel political campaign, independent political campaign. We're using all the different tools of communication, getting endorsements, getting sound trucks on the street, people going door to door. And it was very, very much like a political campaign, and we were trying to get people to take a day out of school, which, some people question whether it's a good idea for this or that. They said it would cost money. It would cost the system money. They said it would be a very bad idea to have kids ditch school, et cetera, et cetera. So we used all these facilities. And then, of course, on Freedom Day, we started getting head counts. And I was on the phone about 90% of that day, and we were getting calls in from such and such a school, 100% empty, 98% empty, et cetera, et cetera. So it was that was like taking election returns, and I think you could have put a different voiceover narrative, and it would look like 20 different independent aldermanic campaigns going on.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the film too, and when you see the film, it makes sense. Miss Rosie, I'm going to come back to you. What was the outcome of Freedom Day? The Freedom Day happened, and then what?
Well, Freedom Day happened, and I think that it made more parents aware of what was going on because you had a lot who were not a part of involved in the organizing, but it made more parents aware of what was going on in the school system. I think that we were able to get rid of Benjamin Willis and I think that what happened, it brought the organizations, the leadership of all the various organizations closer together in terms of agreeing on other projects that we needed to work on in the city. I think it had a good effect on what needed to be done in that to change the situation, the focus on housing and redlining and those kinds of things that we had not focused on before.
It took some time though, didn't it? Because you did a second Freedom Day and we all know it took some time, right? Like the whole movement took some time. But you had a second Freedom Day in February of '64, and it was still a few years before Benjamin Willis resigned, wasn't it?
Right, but that's why we had to have the second Freedom Day. But we knew that we couldn't give up, that we were going to keep on struggling, but we were able to get more parents involved and the more activities in the communities, I think, than we had before. And they began to look at the entire political system that we were faced with. That was also a problem, but yes.
I might add that second Freedom Day in February, because of the success of our first one, the original, a number of cities, I think at least a dozen different cities came to consult with us and talk about it. and we planned the second one not just as a Chicago boycott, but as a semi-national boycott where a dozen or 15 cities, I can't remember how many at this point, were all modeling themselves after after our very successful one in October. So that's one thing that happened, because the problems that we were having in this school system were, I would say, typical, maybe a little worse, maybe a little better than many, many other cities in the country. This was not a unique problem.
Charles, you went on to become an architect. How did this movement inspire you or help you later on in life?
First of all, I was able to graduate from all the schools in Chicago, grammar school, high school, college, University of Illinois Chicago campus, that we called it, which I protested against being built. Couldn't afford to go anywhere else, so I went to that school to get my architectural degree. Then we also had 50 schools closed in the inner city communities. Predominantly Black schools were closed. Now, my attitude was, why weren't all the schools across the whole city closed? Why just certain areas were closed? That issue still exists, and those schools are still closed. And the population in all the schools, West Side, South Side, have diminished like crazy. You do not have, those schools are too big for the students who go. Dunbar, DuSable, you name it, West Side, South Side. Student population's not in those buildings that still remain. What about the buildings that were closed? Why aren't they being used? People still live in those communities. Same population still exists in those communities. But for some reason, the system is not addressing those kind of concerns. And I hate to say, the community not addressing those kind of concerns. And the only people who are suffering as a consequence are the young people trying to be educated, young people trying to get jobs, young people trying to go on to to higher education, so that they won't be stuck in the system that we've been stuck in for 500 years. That's what I have to say.
I would say one thing that's happened that's helped ameliorate the situation a little bit. Back then, the teachers' unions were just really job operations, and the teachers' unions were not, for want of a better word, dedicated to education. They were dedicated to sending, their own salaries and comfort, et cetera, which, you can't deny is very important. But I think since in the intervening years, we began to develop teachers' unions that saw education as improving education in the broader sense, beyond just their own job paychecks. I think helped the situation quite a bit and created a lot of, we were able to get a better foothold against the administrations, the sequence of administrations after the original Daley, other than Herald and up to late date. We had administrations that didn't give a damn about the Black community other than whether they could keep down and quiet.
Tanesha, similar question to you. I want you to kind of get in, because I'm interested in your reaction to the teachers union, but also just kind of where you see the education fight going, especially under this new mayoral administration, but where the fight for education lies today.
I know that, well, Brandis, my position on the teachers union, but I do. I'm not gonna go there. I think that despite years of stagnation and maybe even apathy around, education and politics in Chicago, I think that with everything going on, we're seeing some fire lit under the community again, with especially, not to detour the conversation, but the reallocation of resources from one marginalized community to another, and the migrants coming to Chicago. And so I think that people are rallying around that issue. People are rallying or upset about the uprise in crime in the city and in Black communities, the disengagement of students in schools after COVID, beyond COVID. And so I think that, again, people are getting fired up, and there's an opportunity here in this moment to mobilize around those various issues so that we can get the investments that we need to be successful. Just, again, in the example set by you all, I've been wanting to boycott the schools for a long time, because I understand that when you hit bureaucracies in their pockets, that's when they respond. And so we are actually planning an action very soon in the future. And I would love to have you all collaborate on that. And, we're pushing things forward. So I worked alongside the Black Community Collaborative, and we were able to get a Black Student Success Office installed, or that's in the process of being installed within CPS. And so there are a number of things coming down the line that we're proud of, that we've been pushing for, but I'm even more excited about the opportunity to mobilize people, because they have gotten to the point where they're starting to see the disinvestment, the disenfranchisement, the marginalization, all those things, and they're wanting to push back. So it's a very bright future ahead for creating another movement in Chicago against against the oppression and the racism that has been against Black communities.
Well, we are almost out of time. We do have one question in the chat that I want to get to before probably one more question to close it out. This one is from Chantel Jameson. Hey, Chantel, thank you for the question. Mr. Smith is absolutely right about the community not addressing the educational concerns that affect our children. I'd say it's due in large part to a lack of awareness. How can we remedy this? Who wants to jump on that one?
I'd like to say something to that. I mean, like I said earlier, I'm involved with a group of teachers, principals, and teachers of CPS, and we're talking about intergenerational disconnect between age groups in Black communities specifically, from the time you're born to the time you die. And it's that disconnect that I think have led to where we are today, where we can't get people to rally behind causes and feelings, because the children, it's not passed on from the 20-year-olds back to the children. The 20 and 30 years old is not listening to the 40s, 50s, and 60-year-olds. The 50s, 60s not listening to the elders. And all of that stuff we've had in our life, especially if you're old, 65 years old, you've had the grandmother and all that stuff. We do not have that. We don't see it happening anymore. We're not respecting each other. And I think that's where the real disconnect occurs. And until we can get that going, we will have pockets of people working with you, but you won't have the community that we had in 1963, et cetera, and the 70s. We won't have that. Our think tanks have died off, and we have no future think tanks coming along. Everybody's looking out for themselves. Everybody's concerned about, I can't trust you, I can't trust this, that, or the other. And we got to get away from that philosophy, or we're doomed to fail and continue to fail.
I think some people may be looking forward. I can't say it's going to work, but I think one possible, not complete solution, but a big help to this might be the elected school board, which has been very sought after for a long, long time. And I think they've set one up to fail by having it so huge that nobody can agree on anything. But I think the concept of an elected school board may help bring it closer to the people and perhaps some change. I can't project that it's going to happen, but I think that's one thing salutary that we might look forward to.
Don, I will say, I'm sorry, there's a group called COAL, C-O-A-L, Coalition of African American Organization, Black men in particular, 12 different groups that are talking about that very issue right now, about this elected school board, setting up criteria about what should happen, what should not happen. I think we should pay attention to what they're talking about. That's COAL, C-O-A-L, Coalition of African American Leaders. Just want to mention.
Yeah. If I can, go ahead, Tanesha, and then Miss Rosie, I'm going to come back to you and let you close it out. Go ahead, Tanesha.
Yeah, I think it really is a matter of boots on the ground. You know, my partner and I, we've been working to host conversations within communities. As a matter of fact, we're having a parent meeting this upcoming Wednesday at Movement Everest Charter School. It's on the west side, and we have just authentic conversations about what's going on. The fact that, again, we have an 85% graduation rate and our kids can't read and they can't do math, and they're being suspended, and they're being overclassified as special needs or special ed, but not getting the resources that they need. So having those really authentic conversations that parents understand around the schools aren't supporting our kids the way they need to, and having those consistently will help bring more awareness and mobilize more people. But it really is, along with boots on the ground, is all hands on deck. And any of us that are working in the communities, we have to stand in the gaps where CPS and any other entity that's supposed to be supporting our kids don't. And so I think one of the biggest things is the Black community hasn't felt self-determined in a long time, right? And self-determination leads to having autonomy. And one of the things that the Roots Initiative practices and values is supporting our kids and learning how to be self-determined so that we can have thriving and liberated communities one day. And to Mr. Smith's point, we do have to bridge those gaps between different generations, especially those of us that are aspiring activists and those of us that have done the work, you know, so that we can pass the torch, because one day none of us will be here to do the work. And this fight has been here for 403 years, is going to continue to be here. So 404 years, my apologies. So we have to keep pushing, we have to bridge those gaps, which is, again, I'm all open for and down for meeting with my elders to get that wisdom and that knowledge, and also bringing our young people to have those conversations so they can know how to do this when we're no longer able to. So it's boots to the ground, and it's standing in the gaps of inequity and injustice. We all have to get on board.
Amen.
Sounds like hopefully we're making an intergenerational connection right here, since we've got Tanesha on the line with the three of you. Miss Rosie, I'm gonna give you the last word before we close it out, because you've urged youth to lead education reform, and obviously the movement in '63 was very much youth involved and youth led. Why do you believe young people play such a pivotal role?
I think why did I think young people played such a heavy role? I think it's because they understood that their parents wanted them to get an education. You see, even though my parents, the most important thing was getting an education, and so that they taught their kids and what they knew, and they were interested in that. But I think the problem is the disconnect now in terms of not only the generational gap, but I think that every group, we got so many. I was glad to hear Tanesha say that she has learned how to agree to disagree. And I think that a lot of that is not happening. But we have these individual groups, and they've, like Black Lives Matter and all of they're fighting their individual little battle, and they don't want to listen to, they don't want to sit down and prioritize. And not I'm just using them as an example. Tanisha's problem is education. Well, they need to be meeting and together, that there need to be a coalition, and that's what's lacking. We had a coalition that all of us did not agree. We spent every Saturday sitting down, learning how, disagreeing without being disagreeable, and setting a priority. And I think in listening to one, and we had all generation. We had the religious leaders, we had the business people, and I think until you get that back again and working on that, and that's one of the big problems, that we're just fighting our own little individual battles.
Okay. That's where we're going to have to leave it because we are out of time, but I'm so grateful to all four of you for joining us today. Miss Rosie Simpson, Mr. Charles Smith, Mr. Don Rose, and Miss Tanesha Peeples. Thanks to all of you for spending your afternoon with us. And thank you to our viewers for participating in today's Black Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation. Feel free to submit any story ideas, topics, issues that you think WTTW News needs to be covering to the email that is listed in the chat box. Our producer, Acacia Hernandez, has just dropped her email address in there. So feel free to shoot her a line. We work closely together so she can share with me too. If you enjoyed this conversation, please join us on Chicago Tonight Black Voices, which airs on Wednesdays at 5:30. That is a kind of new time for some of you. So Wednesdays at 5:30 and again at 10 p.m. And then, of course, Chicago Tonight Latino Voices on Thursdays at 5:30 and then again at 10 p.m. And to all of you for joining us, to our panelists, thank you so much for joining us. Take care and have a good afternoon. Bye.